This is the Cedar Creek Church Living It Out podcast, a midweek reminder where we discuss key takeaways and principles from the weekend message to help you live out the truth that you matter.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome to the Living It Out podcast, a weekly podcast to help remind you that you matter. My name is Casey. I am joined by Marna today. Thanks so much for joining us, Marna, and thanks for listening. It is the Monday after Easter. I hope that you enjoyed your Easter weekend. I hope you got to spend some time with some family, some friends. I don't know what that looked like. I know it looks different for all of us right now. But more importantly, I hope you got a chance to go to church. We had an awesome weekend service, had an awesome Easter weekend. It was a lot of fun. And Marna, I'd love to just talk a little bit about Easter. What sticks out to you when you think about the Easter season? I know you've got kids. They're a little older now. So do you guys do the whole Easter basket thing still? I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, not as much. Like you're right. That definitely has shifted here in the last couple of years. So they, of course, still like to get candy in some ways. So we started that terrible thing, but we still do some of that. Like they still have a basket. We don't do eggs as much anymore, but they still have to find a basket. So we still have kind of stayed with that. I never really did the Easter bunny, though. I have to admit, like I was all in on Santa Claus. The Easter Bunny, I always drew short up on it. It was like, we actually, I don't know, like I like evaded that. Yeah.
No, it's funny. You don't have like any theological issue. You're just like, no, I just decided I didn't want to go with the Easter Bunny. Santa's cool though. We're cool with Santa, but just not the Easter Bunny. That's awesome. I love that. Because most parents talk to you like they might have some like deep theological or like some parenting reason why they decide not to go with it, and you're like, no, I just give them candy. It's good. I love it.
Yeah, I just couldn't do it. So maybe there was a theological issue somewhere in there, but I just couldn't do it, you know? So yeah.
I mean, the Easter Bunny is creepy. Like, Santa Claus, the concept of it's like kind of creepy, but then you're like, okay, there's some magic there. But like the Easter Bunny is just creepy. It's like a giant bunny that goes around leaving candy. It's weird.
I know.
It's super weird.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for helping me justify it. So, but we truly do enjoy the Easter service so much, and I think just some of the you just look forward to some of those creative elements and then being able to see how everything comes together and the way that the team really builds that service. It still is such an exciting thing that it's like, man, once you've kind of done all the services, you're like, oh, like you almost want to, like, it's like, oh, we get to do one more. Oh, we get to do one more. And then when it's done, you're like, oh, it's fun. Like, so yeah. How about you?
It's definitely being on staff at a church give you some insight here. Like for those of you listening, obviously, Marna, you just said this, but it is exhausting. Like there's a level of it that is so tiring, but it's like a good exhaustion. We were just talking about this the other day, not having Fusion Camp last summer. Like I missed the I'm so tired I can't move feeling I get after Fusion Camp, but I can still get that with our holiday weekends, and it was a lot of fun. I remember for me growing up, Easter was always a time when our whole family would get to go to church together and enjoy service together because we wouldn't go to kids or wouldn't go to students. We all just go together. And one memory that just sticks out to me, I just have to share it because it's funny. My grandma, who passed away a few years ago, she would always sit next to me and she would sing during like the last song, whether it was like Holy Night at Christmas or whatever song during Easter that would be played, the one that she knew. And she had the worst singing voice in the entire world, but she would sing so loud. And I remember my sisters and I always looking at each other, and Easter just reminds me of this, sitting in church with grandma, looking at each other going like, is grandma going to stop singing because her voice is so bad. But anyway, regardless, that's an anecdote.
I love it.
Easter is a great time. I hope you enjoyed the service. Shout out to Mike Fink. Shout out to the arts team. You guys did an incredible job of creating a great experience in the auditorium, and that transferred online as well. So if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to the Easter service, I'd highly encourage you to go back and listen, because Marna and I are going to do a little bit of a dive here as we talk about what it looks like to live out the weekend message. And so before we kind of transition to the solution, we have to give the problem. And so this weekend, Ben talked about this idea and introduced the idea of darkness. This is an interesting idea. I think all of us can kind of conceptualize what darkness is, right? It's the lack of light. When light's not there, things are dark. And so he talks about like what this looks like for our lives when we're maybe living in darkness. And I think that might even have some spiritual undertones to it, that some of us might go spiritual. Like, what do you mean living in darkness? Like, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm an awful person and I can't do any good? Not necessarily, right? Like it's more of a feeling. So Mara, let's talk about that a little bit. What does it look like to live in darkness? And what do we most of the time, and Ben talked about this, what do we want versus actually living in darkness. It's not what we want to do. We want something else, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that I love the way that he stepped into this in terms of it's sometimes it's just that something's off, or we're not really sure what's going on, or it might even be as specific as there's a relationship that just can't, it's just not quite right, or something continues to kind of happen at work, or sometimes it's even in just our everyday sort of things that it's like I always think of, especially in light of the service, is that darkness is when just something's kind of stirring in you. Maybe it's even just emotions that we deal with in terms of we feel jealous of someone for some reason, or we become prideful in a spot. Like I think those are all the components that ultimately are some form of darkness. Now, obviously, there's things that are really dark that we have. I know you and I both have friends and family that have dealt with addictions and have dealt with incredibly broken relationships, with life challenges that they didn't choose, and that have put them sometimes in that place of that it just feels very dark.
Yeah.
And
So
it is.
that's good. So there's an extreme part to it, right? And then there's also the everyday, like the everyday kind of like, this feels weird. This feels maybe a little bleak. It feels like it isn't what I want, or it isn't what I know it could be, right? There's something there. I think oftentimes we ask ourselves the question, like, what are things supposed to be like? When in reality, we have this intuitive desire or this intuitive need for things to be a certain way. And usually there is some goodness in that desire. And so usually you can even check within yourself and go, is this what I want right now? And if the answer is no, there's probably a little bit of darkness creeping into your life in some sort of way that you don't see. One of the things that Ben said that it reminded me of a line that I've used when I've married people before is like, we all want to be fully known, but we also want to be fully loved. To be fully known, but not to be fully accepted is our biggest fear, right? We don't want to put ourselves out there completely, step out of the darkness, if you will, and be rejected. But we also don't want to be loved, but not be known at all. And I think for a lot of us, that's our reality, right? We are loved, but people don't always know the ins and outs and all the parts of our lives, and that feels really superficial and kind of fake. And so I think we get even within that, like that conundrum, there's a lot of darkness we live in there because we can't express every part about us, because if we do, what if the people around us don't love us the same way that they did before?
Yeah, well said. Yep.
And that could be heavy. That can be really heavy. And I think ultimately that's kind of what it comes down to. And so we have to get comfortable with stepping into the light, with being vulnerable, with putting ourselves out there. And there's a tension there, right? Like there's a tension that exists there. We don't just want to spill all of our life's secrets to everybody all the time. But if we're holding on to so much, it's going to create create a hole, create a gap, create a void in our life that can really eat us from the inside out. Martin, I'd love, if you have any other thoughts on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, I think you captured it really well, Casey. I think it is important for us to remember that there isn't total darkness necessarily, and that there is really a huge variety of how this happens for us. And some of the things that happen out of that, just like you talked about. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that Jesus was not designating one particular darkness over another. He was really stepping in fully into all of these spaces, and really in so many ways. And I know we'll get here, but it's like he is calling something different out in us and really wanting us to see and have a vision that isn't trapped by that or enslaved by that or stuck there. So
A word you just used is vision. And I think, just to continue the metaphor, like if you're talking about darkness here, you don't always see in darkness, right? You can't see what's ahead. You can't see what's next. You don't have clarity on where you want to go, on where you feel God wants you to go. And so that also can be an indicator that I might have some darkness in my life, is the lack of clarity, and not clarity as to like, this is the next step I'm going to take tomorrow, next whatever, right? Like, in generally speaking, where am I going with my life? Purpose, right? Maybe it seems purposeless. I think that's an indicator that maybe there's some darkness in our life. And Jesus talks about this all the time. In fact, the Bible is full of analogies and metaphors of light and dark, and how that affects our lives. And I think I love that Ben talked about this weekend, because I think it's super important for those of us that follow Jesus, for those of us that maybe are listening to this for the first time, just to have the understanding that it's like, which we'll talk about in a second, when we step into Jesus and we step into that being fully known and being fully loved, that's when we actually can experience light and experience it to the fullest. There was a verse that Ben used this weekend that Jesus was essentially asking, like, how is your vision? how is your vision? Can you see? And so I think that's sometimes a good question, a good challenge to ask ourselves is, am I actually in darkness right now, or do I see where I need to be? So, Marna, for you, or maybe just generally speaking, what are some of the things that for followers of Jesus, or not for followers of Jesus, what are some of the things or some of the hurdles that maybe get in our way from identifying that we're in darkness? What are some of the things that go, oh no, I'm fine, I'm good? Maybe you've experienced, you've seen other people experience.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is that we are comfortable. And I think that can lead to, that always kind of stirs me a little bit whenever we talk about being comfortable, because I think there's so much wrapped up into that, right? It's like, am I safe? Am I comfortable? Do I have what I need? And so I think comfort can be a big one, where sometimes if we're not really asking ourselves some of those questions, and really saying, hey, do I have vision here, or am I staying right here because this is comfortable to me? So I think that's a big one that we see and that I experience for sure. I think there's also fear there, or in some ways, to your point, it might be this might be the best that it gets. If we can't really see, maybe in some ways, or we don't, this always gets really stressful, I think, for people, where it's like, where are you going to be in 5 years, or what's your dream, or I don't know if you saw those memes during the pandemic that were like, I bet nobody said they were going to be here when they were asked, in 5 years, so I think that causes a lot of tension, as if we need to have some grand plan almost. But at the same time, if it's like that tension of, it's okay that we don't have a grand plan, but if we feel purposeless, to your point, that's the swing. We also don't want to be there. So I think sitting in a spot where we think maybe this is it, this is as good as it gets, can sometimes leave us in that same spot. So those are a couple of things that came to mind for me. How about you?
No, that's really good. I think the hopelessness that starts to creep in when you feel like, I don't have a purpose, but on the other side, it's like, maybe I am just kind of coasting and I feel good, and I'm content with where I am, and there probably is a lot of darkness inside of me that I'm not necessarily dealing with, but I'm able to wake up, go to work, come home, and just do my thing. But in reality, we have no vision of where we want to go. Now, again, the tension is not that God plans out every step that you need to take and says, here's your plan for your life, because that's just not how it works.
Right.
but what it does look like is it's a guide, if you will, right? What does light do? Does it show you every step you need to take? No, but it gives you a general direction in the way that you need to go. And I think that's where for us to step into that relationship with Jesus, it's like, okay, in order for that light to guide us, we have to first step in and be fully known, and expect and understand that even in that we will be fully loved. And that's a hard mindset, right? Like, I don't always want to be open and honest and completely vulnerable with somebody all the time.
No, that's a super tough mind. I mean, I know we can just say it and it feels like, well, yeah, of course, but you're like, no. That is so tough. It is so tough to, I think, both receive it every day in the sort of fullness that it's offered, but then to offer it back out, and so that becomes, that, like you said, that some of those other thoughts don't become so dominant to us, or it's like, I'm going to hold out on this piece of it. This is super tough. It's super, super tough.
Absolutely. And I think as you step into that, what you realize is the natural rhythms and flows of grace are ones that it's addicting, right? Like, you're like, oh, I was honest and I was still accepted and loved. I was challenged, maybe called into something better, maybe called out on something that I shouldn't be doing, right? But as
Yeah.
you are honest, there is oh wow, like the world keeps moving, like
Yeah.
it does keep going, like it keeps moving on. And even within that self, like even with that within itself is like, that's some grace that God is showing us, is that He keeps the world moving even when our problems or our hiccups or whatever it is that we're struggling with, it's still there. But guess what? The life still goes on, but we move through it, right? And as we
Yeah.
share it, as we open up, as we make ourselves fully known, then we step into the light. And where
Yeah.
Jesus comes into all of this is He kind of gives us a pathway. He gives us an opportunity. He gives us he is the guide. He almost opens up our life to what light actually looks like and what it
Yeah.
actually means to receive that light, and then to in turn be that. I'm going to read this verse from John 8:12, and then we can chat a little bit about what it looks like for Jesus to be that light. I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. What does that mean
Mm.
for you, Marta?
Holy moly. I mean, here's what I loved about what Ben talked about is the way that Jesus talks about himself is so radical that if that doesn't get your attention, uh, like he literally says these things like, I am. Not I thought I was, or so and so said, or whatever it is. So I think right out of the gate, any I am statement is always one of those that it's like, wow.
Right.
I mean, think about what he's saying here about himself. And I think the other piece of this for me is that so much of our popular culture in our world tells us that light can come from somewhere else, or we can generate it on our own, or we can go find it in some place. And so when Jesus makes this radical statement about that he is light, that's what starts to then frame, to your point, what we were talking about, Casey, is when things get hopeless and I look to myself, I'm still coming up empty-handed. There's still hopelessness. But when I look to what he did and how much he overcame, then it's like, oh, that's what it means to be the light. So I think in a lot of ways, I have to hear this so often because I have to be reminded of who he is over and over and over. Or otherwise, I kind of want to pick up that stuff and go, well, somehow I'm going to figure out how to, I'll be able to be that hope. No, okay, I'm still, and so I think he becomes, in so many ways, he gives us the ways to replace that in us that we don't have on our own. We might have it for a little bit. We might be able to do a few of those things, but ultimately, that's what it means to me when I read some of those verses. Is that we are in desperate need of Him, and the way that He answers us with that is extraordinary. It's
Yeah.
wild.
I think some people, when they hear the phrase like "be a light in the world" or Jesus is your light or whatever it is, right? Like those are some maybe churchy phrases. I think for some of us, even that grew up in church, we think that means that we have to like be a cheerleader for Jesus, and that's not always a bad thing, but that's almost what I think about when I think about this.
Mm.
But in reality, it's understanding that Jesus shined His light the brightest in the moment that seems the darkest, right? Like the moment where He gave His life
Yeah,
as a sacrifice, right? Like he died, He physically died. And I think when you think about that, like that is not an aggressive way of being a light. Like He didn't do anything. He almost did the opposite, but and put others before Him. So it's opposite of what we would think. So yes, like be a light, but also be a light and look at the example of Jesus and
that's
how He
right.
did it. He put everyone else before Himself. So ultimately, if you want to be a light, like die to yourself and elevate others the same way
Yeah,
that God did that for you. And I
yeah,
think that's super tricky. That's super tricky because that's counterintuitive. That doesn't necessarily go with what we would want, because we would think, what do I have to do? What do I have to accomplish or achieve? Or what's my checklist? And there's elements
yeah,
of that make it more helpful. But at the end of the day, it's the reminder that the selflessness that Jesus showed is ultimately the brightest light that can ever be shown. And if you can understand that and capture that and make that personal for you, then you're able to live a life that is bright, like Calvin talked about a few weeks ago. So
yeah,
I think that all of that kind of ties together for me, at least, when it comes to Jesus being the light and the resurrection, is this idea of ultimately selflessness and dying to yourself, and what we celebrate on Easter and the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection, is what light is all about.
Yeah.
In so many
Yeah.
ways. And just like you said, that comes from one place, which I think is super important to acknowledge too.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because we sometimes get questions about like, why don't we focus on the crucifixion or the resurrection specifically? And not that we don't, because we obviously talked about it this weekend. But I think one of the things that we love to do is really look at that long view of all of Jesus's life. And what he was demonstrating for us at every point, which all of it was pointing to the resurrection. All of it was pointing to who he was. All of Scripture does, really. But I sort of, to your point, Casey, I love what you talked about there, because it's what he demonstrated both on this Easter Sunday, but throughout the 3 years that we know so much more about his life during that time. And so, I sometimes I think about, like, what if Jesus hadn't done any of that, and he were just crucified and he raised, and he was like, we'd be like, wow. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. But he demonstrated so much for us, so
Right.
it's like you can't just take one or two of those things. So I do love how we look at his whole life, to be able to really look at the Easter story,
That's really good.
because yeah, it's all of it. It's all of it.
Totally agree. It's a holistic approach. I think it's funny because there is an expectation that Easter is going to be about the crucifixion and resurrection, but it's like, if you take that out of the whole life of Jesus, like, that is cool. It's kind of magical in some ways, but it misses all of everything else he talked about. Like, dying on a cross means nothing if it's not out of selflessness, if it's not out of being
Right.
God incarnate in the world. Like, all of that is part of it too. So that's
Yeah.
well said. I totally agree with that, and it makes me too. It makes me grateful that we don't just focus on those two singular events and break down all the details of it, because there's nothing wrong with that sometimes. But
That's
ultimately,
right.
it is this whole view of who Jesus is. Ben
Yeah.
talked a little bit about how the resurrection, though, what it does is it does impact us, right? Because if we're
Yes.
surrounded by darkness because we're constantly trying to maybe perform or trying to be perceived a certain way in the world, and so we put on our mask or whatever it is, right? And then we're able to be honest, to be known, and then we realize we're loved even when we are known, fully known. Every part of us, we're still loved. That wrecks you and changes your life forever. And I think when you look at the story of Jesus, the crucifixion and then the resurrection, it means something, right? It gives
Yeah.
us a few things. It puts a little more weight into all of this. And so, do you want to remind us a little bit of what Ben gave us, three kind of things that it reminds us of the
Yeah.
resurrection?
But no, I think these three things are really important, and it's almost, again, what we have to come back to is that really that Jesus gives us purpose in the mundane, because this is sort of what we talked about. Like, if we don't feel like we have purpose, then that casts darkness and a shadow over all sorts of things.
Everything,
And
right?
so that's in part what Jesus gives us. He gives us power over our pain, and the reality is we live in a broken world, and there is a lot of pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, or both, and that's such a reality for so many people. And so when we can really trust that he demonstrated that for us and gives us the power over our pain, it might not make that day to day go away, but it gives it meaning, at least. And that he's in it with us. And that the last thing is that he gives us a promise that the best is yet to come. And I think that's where I do sort of, like you said, I love the whole scope of what Jesus did, and being sure to look at the resurrection, and understanding what it means in this big story of what God is doing. But the story hasn't ended. It's not like the resurrection and it's the end.
Right.
And so I think it's just such a constant reminder to us that he did have more that's coming, and so we can be hopeful and expectant and be able to look forward and cling to that hope in some ways that seasons of life I mean, sometimes you just don't have any other choice. It's all you've got.
Right. Right.
And so I think those are three powerful reminders for us of the
Absolutely.
resurrection specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I hope that the Easter message, the weekend message, this Easter
Hmm.
service, was a reminder for all of us that we don't have to live in darkness, that we don't have to wear a mask our whole life trying to be someone we're not. There's a God out there that wants us to be fully known and is going to fully love us,
Yeah.
regardless of what that known piece uncovers. And
Yes.
I think some of us need to really hear that and really lean into that and listen to that today. And for others of us, we need to be reminded that we have a purpose, that there is a purpose in the mundane, that there's power in our pain. There is a
Hmm.
reason and purpose, and the reason we're going through hard things. And then, like you said at the end, that there's the best is yet to come. That as we lean into the light, as we continue to be fully known and fully know others and fully love them, even though
Yeah.
they are flawed just like we are.
Yes.
Man, there's so much goodness that can come out of that. There's so much life that can flourish. And we said this before, but relationships are experienced in their fullness when we model what our relationship looks like with God, with
Hmm.
each other. And I think that is so important. So I
Yeah.
hope that was encouraging for you today. For those of you listening, I know that the Easter message is always maybe one we have some expectations for, but I hope it maybe didn't meet your expectations. I hope it surprised you a little bit, and I hope you left
Yeah.
service going, you know what, that was a good message, which I totally did, and I hope that you
Hmm.
did too. Well, next week we are starting a new series called The Adventure of You. Easter's
Yes.
over. We're headed into spring. It's like nice outside, so we're starting a new series, and I'm excited about it. We'll be talking a little bit about you, about your journey,
Yes.
and what it looks like to find purpose in it. Continuing the conversation, because all of us have a story. Every
Yes.
single person has a story, and God is still writing all of our stories. And I think I'm excited for this series because I think it's going to point out and show us that God is constantly working on our purpose and giving us purpose, just like we said, even in the mundane, even in the things that
Yes.
don't seem very purposeful. Martin, any other thoughts or things that I'm maybe missing here before we wrap up?
No, not at all. I am looking forward to the next series. And I think, just we're experiencing more people getting comfortable with coming back. And so it's so fun for that side of it. And certainly online is, still super vibrant. And so I think just the opportunity to continue the conversation, like you said, that it's not just a rule book that we're following, but that we are on an adventure. And I know sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but I think sometimes we can reframe it and really start to see it differently too. So I'm looking forward to
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Me too. Me too. Cool. Thanks, Martin. Well said. Well, thanks so much for listening today. Again, it's our hope that you are reminded that you matter. Take care. Have a great rest of your week.